province in at least, I think it's 15 emergency departments, if I'm correct, Les. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you and thank you, welcome everybody, and thank you, Les, for presenting this afternoon. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Julian. It's actually a pleasure to do this. I have to warn everyone, this is my first time actually doing a webinar, so it'll be a little bit of a learning experience for me as well as everyone else. Anyway, I'd like to just start here. First thing we have to do is just get a little perspective before we get into this. And let's see here. Slides are moving. There we go. And starting off with this, which is a letter I sent to our CEO when I was at the Columbian, when I was the chief. You can see the date on there, 1992, and I addressed this letter to him. I used the words, things are unsafe in our department. I did that on purpose because this has already been going on for a long time, and I used a word like unsafe that I knew for administrators was absolute poison. They couldn't stand this, and it got his attention. That's what I wanted. So that was a long time ago. That's, in fact, 20 years about. This has been going on for a long time, and it's just not only at the Columbian. I just want to point out a little bit of history before we just dive into this. This is a report, you see the date on there, 1993. This was a bed availability system we put across the region. At the time it was called the Greater Vancouver Regional District. So it tied together all the hospitals in the Vancouver Regional all the way out to Surrey and Langley, and then out to UBC on the other end. Tied them together with an information system that would tell you at any time how many beds there were available. So this was pre-BC Bedline. In fact, kind of the grandfather to BC Bedline. I pulled out one of the reports that I happened to save, and you can see that for that particular month, the percent of time no medical beds were available. Royal Columbian was 100%. Surrey was 95.8, and so on. Anyway, this fluctuated, of course, time to time a little bit, but generally, this is what it showed all over the place. There weren't any beds, especially medical beds. It wasn't just Canada and America. The United States was in the same problem. This is from the Washington Post, as you can see, in May 2001, a long time ago. At that time, this is the headlines: America's ERs and critical. Read the big things there. You can read this and you won't know whether you're talking about America or Canada or Vancouver or where. Again, very similar things. Very interesting that a very different system, not a public system as such. So they kind of went in one direction with their private systems. Canada went the other direction with their with public health care. And in the end, somehow they ended up in the same place. And there's a story behind that. But you should know that the Americans took this very seriously as well. This is a report that came out in 2000, 6 years ago. At the time by the Institute of Medicine, a very well-respected group in the United States. Just look at some of the words in there. They say, we are definitely not prepared for the onslaught. We hope this report will astonish the nation. So they're really looking for a big bang here. They're trying to scare people and say, you know what, this is not sustainable. Again, it's a long time ago, and this is, but this is a report from one of the most respected institutions in healthcare in the United States, the Institute of Medicine. So, you know, by the time it gets to them, this is the kind of thing they were advising. I mean, they were saying that we need stronger overcrowding standards. We have to recommend that hospitals stop boarding patients in the ERs, diverting ambulances. You recognize all that? I do. I hope most of you do as well. So yeah, of course, you know, we all said, well, you know, this is bad, but wait till something bad happens, and then they'll get it. Lots of bad things happened. I just pulled one up that I happen to have a sample of. This is the East General Hospital in Toronto, of course, and a death in the waiting room. And of course, this is not that unusual. We keep seeing the odd death. Hopefully, it's not terribly common, but of course, it's the worst possible outcome. But even these episodes haven't really changed much. This is a long time ago. Although it would be unfair to say it didn't provoke any action. It did provoke action. This happens to be Ontario's response, more or less, to that emergency. Again, you can see the summer of 2005. This is a province-wide report in Ontario, improving access to emergency services, system commitment, you know, very glossy distribution, lots of effort into it. If they put this out in the summer of 2005, you know it started 2 years earlier, before that at least. And this is the kind of things they said at that time in the report. We're going to put together an effectiveness working group. Complete focus and commitment is required throughout each organization, so on. So a lot of effort into it, even then. Critical recommendations. This is, again, the Ontario report. So just look at near the bottom here. Progress towards benchmarks. We have to make some benchmarks. We have to work with the Ontario Hospital Association Joint Planning Committee to determine the feasibility of integrating ED performance and ambulance offloading measures into ministry accountability. Wow, amazing words, right? Strong words. And again, not only Canada and the United States, this is a worldwide phenomenon. I have a friend in Australia who I kept in touch with, who was an emergency physician, and he told me that finally he published a report, a study that is, that actually documented that not only was it bad for people to have overcrowding in emergency, not only was it bad in the waiting room, but even after they got into the hospital, the 30-day hospital higher situations where there was overcrowding. He published this report again in 2004, and published in a major journal. And his conclusions were that overcrowding is a big patient safety concern, not just workflow, not just an emergency issue. It affects the entire hospital. It's a very interesting study in case you do want to look it up, because he had to come up with a measurement tool for. That's one of the things we've had a lot of trouble with, is measurement tools. He created this thing he called the overcrowding hazard scale. It was extremely simple. It was a ratio of boarders to actual empty beds. Very, very simple. But it was.
Is there a way that someone could put themselves on mute so that background noise isn't so overpowering over Dr. Vertesi?
Thanks very much. Well, we've had a problem with definitions. Now, I don't want to belabor things like definitions, because who cares? We know what the problem is, don't we? But, of course, you remember the old adage, if you can't define it and you can't measure it, then, of course, you can't fix it. And I think that's been one of our problems. After all these years, there still isn't a consensus. Now, we all have different ways of measuring it. We all have different things we do. I'm not saying we have nothing. The point is there is no consensus across either our country or in North America, in fact, anywhere in the world, on exactly what it is, exactly how to measure it, exactly where the thresholds are, and how to build safeguards against even getting close to that. We have a lot of options of measuring admitted patients, but it's not just admitted patients. Is it the time in the department? Well, time in the department is part of it, but it's not all of it. So this, to me, has always been an interesting thing, and I've spent a fair amount of the mathematical part of my career anyway. I'm sort of an amateur mathematician, and Julian mentioned my role at the university, but part of it trying to come up with some definitions. So we've had several options, things like waiting. Well, nobody likes waiting, and that's useful. We created CTAS criteria for waiting, but are they useful for measuring crowding? And the fact is, they are not. I mean, I won't go into details. They are good for sort of for QI analysis in your department where you've got problems. That's what they're designed for. They're not useful for overcrowding in any sense. Grant Innes came up with a term called access block, and this is many years ago. Probably most of you have heard of it. And he used that as a definition of crowding. It wasn't the emergency was crowding. It was the patients had trouble accessing the hospital, which is completely accurate on a conceptual basis and good for Grant because it, in fact, worked quite well for a short period of time at the hospitals where we put it in. Basically, he said, you know, when we have one stretcher left, that's the definition to us that the hospital has to move. And when we have only one stretcher left in the emergency, that means the wards have to take our admitted patients or take some of the admitted patients. So this is a kind of a push. He managed to get it through the boards and political process in the hospitals here when he was still in Vancouver. That was before he went to Calgary. And it was effective, but in a limited way. It was effective in sort of a last-ditch effort. That's partly why it was effective. But, of course, it wasn't sustainable because in the long run, these things, they do grind to a halt. The wards do dig in their heels, and it can't be sustained in the big picture. The overcrowding hazard scale, I mentioned it again because of Peter's frivolous. But the point is that all of these measures assume everything else is fixed. And, of course, they're not. In real life, everything is moving. Everything is changing. So we're still looking for what's the real definition of crowding. I want to tell you a little story because way back in 1992, at the Columbia, when I was chief there of emergency, I complained so much that finally the medical director at the time said, okay, we're going to solve this once and for all. We're going to give you all the money you want to study it and come up with an answer. Now, all the money I want wasn't a money to fix it. All the money I wanted was in the analysis itself. So, but anyway, really, there was no holds barred. We created a working group. We looked at all the data. We had a ton of data. We looked at all of it. It was kind of, everyone was going kind of buggy-eyed because you don't know where to start when you're looking at that much data. So one of our analysts said, why don't we just let the computer tell us what the most important measure is of congestion? Let's ask it the question. We have all these days. Some are congested, some are not. What is the most powerful predictor, the single most powerful predictor of being congested on any particular day? And we all said, yeah, let's ask the computer. So we did this huge multivariate analysis. You can imagine in those days what we were using was like Pentium chips and so on. Anyway, he said he got the program running, and he said we'll have to wait for it to run. It could be several days. Well, we waited and waited and waited. In fact, it was almost 3 weeks. Finally, we were getting to the point where we wanted to interrupt the program and say, let's stop. Maybe something's wrong. No, we let it run. 3 weeks later, it ended up and gave us the answer of the multivariate analysis. And here was the answer. Are you ready? The best predictor of ED congestion on any given day was being congested the day before. Now, we kind of looked at this. I don't know about you. I looked at this and go, yeah, I can see where that's true, but it's not useful. I can see where it's true. And the problem is, this actually points out the problem very well because, in fact, as we get into it, there is no single parameter that can measure ED congestion by itself because it isn't one parameter. It's a cumulative phenomenon. It's a composite of multiple parameters and independent processes. It happens dynamically over time. It includes randomness and the whole thing. And in fact, if you try and actually really come up with a true definition that will hold water, it has to be multifactorial. It ends up being a probability function. And I'm sorry, but it gets complicated, too complicated to give to politicians, too complicated to get to users and managers. They want something simple. They want something, that people need something they can hum, as Tom Leary used to say. And it doesn't work when it's this complicated. So we have problems with this because, in fact, we do need something simple. So a question maybe another way. So all this time, has anyone ever solved the problem? Well, I'm not even going to spend any time on all the efforts we've done, such as diversion and critical care bypass and things like that, which were attempts to solve it, which are completely non-productive, and in fact made things worse. But a couple of things. First of all, the 4-hour rule in England in the NHS hospitals seems to be standing the test of time. Now, it has proponents and opponents, and no question at the time it created new problems, different problems. But as far as emergency was concerned, they solved the problem of emergency congestion for quite a while, and they seem to be holding water still. The overcapacity protocol here in Vancouver and Calgary that Grant Innes started made significant improvements, but again, in the long run, it wasn't sustainable. So we're going to focus a bit on pay for performance, which is sort of the current flavor of the month, I guess, a year. And it's been tried. There are other places that have done it, of course, but I'm going to concentrate a little bit on Ontario and then Vancouver, which are the ones that I've been involved with. Mainly Ontario, only to point out that there are other people kind of following us. Ontario may say, they probably do say that they invented it, but no, it started here, and they took it and kind of made some changes. In the end, it's not as effective there because of some of the changes. I'm going to walk through a little bit of how we do it here and point out some of the differences. So we're going to go to sort of what do we do here in BC, where are we going, what's been the successes, what's left to do, where has it worked, and where has it not worked. So again, as most of you I hope know, if you're involved in this, we pay a per patient fee here and not a monthly target because, and I say that because Ontario does use a monthly target. Instead of per patient, it's so many patients, 90% within such and such, and across the month. Now, I've always felt that monthly targets are fine for board meetings, but people who do healthcare, people who look after patients, don't care about monthly targets. They're interested in patients. So we made it a per patient fee to make it more relevant. And the $100 and $600, $600 representing the admitted patients, which is a much higher mark, because it's much harder to do. The money is for patients above a baseline, and the baseline means that we don't pay for all the patients meeting these targets. We only pay for the ones that are above a baseline. The baselines are set specific to each hospital. So in other words, each hospital is competing with their own history, not across the province, because they're all starting at different places. This is, again, something Ontario didn't do. They set monthly targets across the board, and some hospitals are better off than others, and then it becomes difficult to disentangle. The money doesn't go to any individual, it goes to the hospital. That, more or less, is the way it's done in Ontario as well. So let's come back to, well, what are we trying to do with it anyway? What is it? And I keep stressing that it's not actually a method of improvement in itself. The way to improve continues to be the same way we've always learned. It's using QI methods, it's using trials, it's using change methodology of processes. If all you do is put a funding process in, nothing by itself is going to change at all. And in fact, we've seen that happen. Money is not a reward. In healthcare, people dig in their heels a bit about money. When they get improvement and they actually see the improvement, that's the reward. And once they do see it, then they don't want to give it up. They really don't. We keep saying it's not about the money. I keep telling them it's not about the money. Every time we start one of these programs, I come and give this talk, and at the end of it, I have them all chanting, it's not about the money, it's not about the money, it's about the improvement. And yes, they do that. But if it's not about the money, if it's not a reward, then why do we tie the money to performance? And the answer is it's a shared risk thing. It's really government saying, look, we'll share the risk of what you decide to do because we don't actually know anything about it. We don't actually know if what you do is going to work or not. How do we know? If it works, we're happy to participate in it. If it doesn't work, I'm sorry, we want to limit our share, our exposure to the cost because we don't necessarily trust that you're going to do the right thing because in the past you haven't always done the right thing. So they've got a point there. It's a shared risk. We made several assumptions in doing this. We assumed that the people who actually work in the hospitals want to do this. They want their ERs to be better. And they know what things need to be done. If they had some money, they could maybe do something, but of course, traditionally, they don't have any control, they don't have any money, all the money is controlled up above, so they kind of give up. So the assumption is that if we turn that upside down and give the money to people who work in the departments and know what to do, gives them a little control, then maybe things will move. It also indicates that the money being on the table indicates that government is serious about it. They put up this year, last year as well, $25 million for EDP for P alone, outside of everything else. So it does indicate that there's some seriousness behind it. So the question is, does it work? People say, well, does it work? Maybe it doesn't work. Well, I can show you examples where it works. Here's one hospital over 4 years. These graphs are limited to admitted patients getting in within 10 hours. I try to take away the other clutter. I mean, there are other improvements also in CTAS 1, 2, 3s and so on, but because the admissions are the difficult ones, I'm just limiting it to that, so there's only one thing in the graph. So we've gone from a baseline of about 45% to 70% or so in one hospital over 4 years. That's a significant improvement. And there are other hospitals where it doesn't work. Here we've gone from 45% down to 30%. Gradually you can see things getting more and more depressed. And both of these are P for P hospitals, so we can find examples of both situations. The real question isn't does it work or not. The real question is what are the factors associated with either success or failure so we know how to steer this. Is it knowing how to spend the money? Is it the ability of management? Is it the staff? What is it? Is it where people start? If they start in more difficult places, more difficult occupancy, maybe they're cooped even to begin with. Maybe something else has to happen. So the question is, what are the factors? So we're going to try and follow this through because they're multiple. I'm going to try and follow one hospital through with the start of EDP for P and just show you some things and that maybe you hadn't thought of that are all associated. Which hospital we chart with doesn't matter particularly, but I've chosen here Richmond. This is the first 18 months of EDP for P. They went from a basket case of less than 40% meeting targets of 10 hours to, in fact, close to 80%. We defined 80%, by the way, as perfect because of the way the percentiles are set up. That would equal a 2 plus 2 plus 2 department. We don't really expect people to get perfect. That's as good as you're going to get. And they were the stars, and they really performed well. A couple of things this graph doesn't tell you. First of all, it was a real improvement. Let me tell you, I went in and checked it out. Before they started, at first I thought, oh, this hospital's so bad, we shouldn't even do it here. This is going to be bad. But no, they did it. And things really got better. The merge got cleaned up. The flow improved. People were happy. But one thing this doesn't show you, and what it doesn't show you is they spent $5 million. But the revenue was only $4 million. So they're actually $1 million in the hole on the ED pay-for-performance part alone. So, of course, this is not sustainable. In fact, at this time, at the end of this period, they got a new administrator, and the instructions were we've got to cut back and save a bit of money. So the following year, you can see the performance because, of course, they had to pull out some of the things they've done. The other thing that happened during this time, again, not apparent on the graph, is the hospital, the community, lost something like 28 extended care beds. And the reasons for that had nothing to do with emergency. It had to do with things like the facilities were old, they couldn't be maintained, there was a building process which took longer than thought and so on, but they lost the beds. They scrambled to try and find some beds. They did find some, but in the end they ended up losing something like 15 beds anyway, extended care. So that compounded their problem. The following year, things got a little better because they managed to replace some of those beds, but not much because, in fact, they continue to get worse. So all these factors came into play. It wasn't just the EDP for P. So what else changed over time? Well, here's what else changed over time. Wasn't apparent on the other graph. Their volumes. So this is, the blue graph is a change in visit volume, is a percentage of their baseline. And the purple one is the change in actual admissions. Just watch my time here. And you can see that admissions have gone up, 25% roughly over that time. Now this is over 4 years. And visit volume also has gone tremendously up. Both of those, especially the admissions, it's not sustainable because those admissions aren't just admissions in that day in emergency, and they're staying for a week or whatever. And so it's a cumulative problem. So with essentially otherwise the same budget except for EDP for P, this is what was killing them. A lot of that rise occurred in the first few years. So if we don't address the problem of growth, then we're not going to make it. And that was the first lesson that we learned over the first year or two, couple of years. The original assumptions coming into EDP for P here was that volumes would stay the same, the admissions would stay the same. There's going to be increases in visit volume, I knew that. And actually the formula in EDP for P allowed for that. It did compensate for visit volume, but not for admissions. Well, why not? Well, the reason was, frankly, if I'd said to government that 4 years ago, by the way, we'll build in a formula that if the admission volumes go up, then we'll pay for it, they would have just chased me out of the park. There was no way they were going to do that. So, and also, I didn't know how to forecast it. So basically, we assumed no growth, which, of course, was completely wrong. Even $600 doesn't keep up with that. And, in fact, the EDP for P formula allows you to ignore, once you miss the 10-hour target, then forget it if there isn't any kind of gain in the original formula. So, in fact, it was possible for hospitals to just ignore the admissions once they did what they could about the 10 hours. So Lionsgate is another example of how the volumes affected it. So this is the first 30 months performance after EDP for P. Again, very difficult baseline. This is historical baseline from the previous year, less than 30%, or 35% or so of patients meeting admitted patients meeting targets. Big improvements, and then a bit of a fall. First of all, they had a big epidemic of gastro, which closed down their extended care beds and their wards and other issues. Again, not part of EDP for P, but it affects performance. But in general, they were able to really improve and build up this other thing. They were actually building a new department at the time, so there's lots of things here. I don't even have time to talk about it, but lots of other issues going on at the same time that affected their performance. So here's what happened. Very good. They also actually put in an inpatient activity called eye care, which got patients off the wards faster. So they moved patients out. They decreased their length of stay. They opened up new beds. ALC proportions in that hospital dropped to 4% from a standing percentage of 11. So they did a lot of great stuff. So what was the problem? That problem was that once they, of course, created that capacity, they got bombarded by emergency, but not only emergency, BC bed line started in cases, and those cases were filled. The ALC cases are relatively inexpensive, but the new cases are relatively much more expensive because they're sicker, and they were on a fixed budget during that time. So up to that time, they had to absorb whatever increases came up with their existing budget, and guess what? They went to a $4 million deficit. Now, even doctors understand that you can't sustain a $4 million deficit indefinitely. You can't just do that. You've got to do something about it. So they did. And they changed their policies, and guess what? Emerge started to drop again. So again, these things are not part of EDP for P, but of course they completely affected the performance of these hospitals. And in the meantime, by the way, here's the volumes. This is emergency volumes. We're not counting the BC bed line here, but even their emergency volumes went up by 25% for admissions and almost 40% by their visits. So again, none of that had been addressed up to that point. So I say EDP for P is a partial answer. If it's properly done, and if it's not properly done, it doesn't do anything. But if it's properly done, it'll give ED staff some resources. It lets them reconfigure things. It lets them get a little motivated. It helps with ED volumes and some inefficiencies a little bit. But it cannot correct hospital capacity problems, and it cannot keep up with growth in admissions if that's going to happen. So the other parts of the answer are really important. One is the unstable funding horizon refers to the fact that when you give people one-time money and you say, well, at the end of the year it's going to be gone, you can't expect them to really pull out all the stops, because all they do is create more costs than they can't sustain. So that makes them very, very cautious, to say the least. And that was a problem. I think that's gone now, because the government now, this is now fourth year in BC. EDP for Peace seems to be here to stay. We have another $25 million for next year. So the horizon seems to have been fixed. Inpatient growth, of course, though, requires something else. And that also we've addressed in BC, but only since April of 2010 with activity-based funding. So ABF, or activity-based funding, pays for all admissions and provides a supplement in addition to the fixed budget if hospital capacity, if hospital services, including admissions, goes up. Mind you, if you start a little farther back to the base year, maybe you need a catch-up. But at any rate, in BC now, EDP for P and ABF are coupled and work together. As of April 2010, the activity-based funding provides a new revenue source for hospitals that actually does keep pace with admissions, because the amount of money is substantial, and does, so all those rising things do get paid if the money, but the money still has to be used, right? If the money's not used and hospitals keep it and don't invest it, then nothing's going to happen. And the new kid on the block here to help with the emergency is the DDFE, which I hope most of you know about. DDFE stands for patients who are discharged directly from emergency. So these are all those patients that you've asked for a bed for, no bed is ever given. They spend their entire admission in hospital and go home from there. Service not provided. And of course, there's been no penalty in the past for this. People could do it and it didn't really matter, and they did it rampantly. Now, there's a penalty for it, because those patients do not attract any money from activity-based funding, and it's a substantial amount of money. Collectively, the hospitals in British Columbia from 2010 to 2011 in a 1 year lost collectively $5.2 million in a change of year from DDFEs that they didn't look after because they let DDFEs got worse. And they weren't watching it. Well, their attention is on it now. $5.2 million is a lot of money that they simply walked away from. So we'll see if they continue to do that. The only way to get that money is to decrease the emergency department's inpatient load. So let's look at VGH for a moment here. The thing here is that this is their change in visit volume and admits. This is over 5 years, but you can see that they are just as bad as everyone else in terms of visit volume, maybe worse. They'll say they're worse, but at any rate, significant increases in admissions, especially 20% or so over their base year. So how do they deal with it? Well, what they did was they used ABF. They said, we're going to use ABF to do it. But here was the question that they posed to me. This is last year. They said, we've been trying to do this. We've been trying to open new capacity. ED's going crazy. And as soon as ED stretchers are full, there's no stretchers. We do create new beds. We bring in people. We do all this stuff, but it's killing us. It's going to break our budget. We can't keep doing this. What do we do? How do we keep doing the right thing without breaking the budget? So the answer was a bit of a calculation. The question is, how much do these patients cost you who are actually admitted? The answer was $350 a day. They stay 10 days, right? The formula, the dollar formula, provides $1,500 or so per each weighted case, and the weighted cases of Vancouver General, the weight, by the way, is complexity. It's tied to something called RIW, which is Resource Intensity Score, which is essentially the measure of cost or complexity. So VGH is high, it's 2.3 per patient. That means they're getting almost $3,500 per new admitted patient out of this formula alone, in addition to the EDP for P formula. So we said, hey, you're getting $3,500 for these cases, and it's 10 days, and $350 times 10 is the same amount of money. Actually, you're breaking even. Do the math. You're breaking even with this. The trouble is, if you wait and don't invest the money, and you're inundated, you're going to lose that money because they stay as DDFEs. You're not going to capitalize on the emergency improvements that can be made. So you've got to think ahead and invest this ahead of time. And that's exactly what they did. So the start of activity-based funding in 2010 is that little blue line, and you can see that this is, again, their emergency performance improved and went up to, even though they had such a big increase in volumes, because they went aggressively to invest that money in moving those emergency patients out of emergency onto a place that's a real bed. So, and also Richmond Hospital, I didn't show you the last part of their graph, but they were able to use some of the same systems because they're in the same health authority. And the last year, they actually figured that out too and said, wow, we can use this. We have the information. The money's going to be there. Let's do it. And they've also been able to improve their performance. So it's not just a peculiar thing at Vancouver General. And there are other hospitals that have done this, but I don't have time to show you them all. I'm going to run out of time as it is, I think. So the money followed the patient at Vancouver Coastal, and for that reason, their performance did improve. Because the EDP for earning, when you combine them with activity-based funding, it equals the cost of opening a new bed. So, all of you are familiar with Tim Hortons, and you all know the news story of the year last year. And the question is, why did this happen? It happened at an EDP for P hospital. Why? Well, first of all, we are tracking EDP for P tracked time, right? Total time for the patient. That tells us nothing about where they're being managed. And people who are in a congested department, you'll have to get pretty efficient. You will bring down that transit time because you have to. But if we forget about where they're being treated, then we're completely walking into Tim Hortons place. If 75% of your patients are being placed in inappropriate locations, none of that's being tracked, we're heading all towards Tim Hortons sooner or later. And it's like, it's like these patients in the hallway, we can move them quickly, but that's not going to make us not congested. That's not what we want to do here, and that's not what we want to reward. If we don't even count where they are, then we're not going to know that. Nope, it's out of sight, out of mind. So I think if we really want to end PD congestion, it's not enough to be dealing with time management. We're also going to have to be looking at where patients are in an apartment, where they're placed, where they're managed. Are they managed in a proper stretcher location, or in the hallway, or in the waiting room, or in the parking lot? And we're going to have to create some kinds of consequences similar to the time consequences we have for EDP for P. One last thing about hospital beds, and I'm getting close to finished. We all know that, hey, if you just give us some beds, then crowding will go away. And we all start off in a different place with a number of beds. And so, how far can we push this? And I think it's really interesting to know just where we stand in Canada and in BC and in Vancouver, if you like, if you work in Vancouver, relative to everywhere else in the world. Is it a level playing field? So just to interest you a little bit in this, I'm going to throw in some stats from, these are statistics collected by the OECD, which is the Organization of Exporting Developing Countries. I keep forgetting what the acronym stands for. Very highly credible international organizations with about 25 country members. They do a lot of healthcare monitoring and a lot of reports, not just healthcare, mostly economics, but they've got a big healthcare section, and highly credible. So this is a couple of years ago, but the graphs don't change very much. So this is the acute care hospital beds per 1,000 population comparing countries. So the red horizontal line is Canada, and you can see the Canada is at 2.7. The dark green is the later one. The light green is 1995, so it shows you the change. That's where we are. The big red thing bar in the middle is the OECD average for all the countries. And you can see that there's not very many countries lower than us. We're among the lowest there. Mexico is lower than us. Now, interestingly, Sweden is low. It's not necessarily a bad thing that we don't have a lot of extra beds. It's not a bad thing, because just because you have the beds, that doesn't mean you're using them effectively. So fine, but it gives you some fix. So next we look at hospital discharges per 1,000 population. Now, discharges is the same as an admission. This essentially counts how many people the hospital served, how many patients went to a hospital in an acute care bed. And again, you can see where Canada is, and the only country that's lower than Canada is Mexico. Every other country provided more patients with hospital care than Canada did. And the OECD average is way up there compared to where Canada is. So that's an interesting thing. Now, then we come back to what about the occupancy rate? And Canada is on the far left end of the occupancy rate. Our occupancy rate is 89% there, but that includes all of Canada, including the remote areas in the north and so on, which have traditionally very low occupancies. If you're looking at the core centers, the big cities, the average occupancies there are much higher. And again, the OECD average is in the middle there, about 75%, so you can see the spread. So that's Canada, and then if you want to know about BC, I did this a few years ago, and again, I don't think things have changed that much. It's actually hard to get all this information together. You have to ask for it, and then you have to wait a long time to get it. But the trend over these 5 years that I tracked it showed that BC, the beds per population, had dropped dramatically to below the rest of Canada average. Now, actually, Ontario and BC are pretty close to tied. It doesn't show up in the average. We both have pretty much the same level. And since 2004, BC has gone even a bit lower. And again, if you go into the densely populated, the lower mainland area of BC, it's even lower than this average. So the point is that EDP4P is only a funding mechanism, and the rest does remain a QI process. We all know that beds are a part of it, but all of us have been able to do some things with EDP4P alone. So even though we're tight for beds, we're able to do some things. But EDP4P really works best inside a context of activity-based funding. Without that, you're going to lose it because of the growth involved, if there is growth. And by the way, there's been growth in every emergency part, not every one singly, but across all the provinces and all the major cities, the rule is growth. So, and BC is the only province right now that has any activity-based funding per se. So without that, none of these EDP4P mechanisms are going to work because they're not going to be able to keep up with the work. Even then, it only works if it's, of course, done right. And there's a lot to make it done right. I can't tell you all the things that do work because they're specific to the hospital, but I can tell you what doesn't work. I'm going to give you a list of 5 things that if you did them, you could ensure that EDP4P is not going to work. First thing I'm going to tell you is you make all the decisions at the top. Don't give any decision-making authority to the people who work in the department. Make sure all the spending is controlled at the top. And you're going to alienate all your workers and they'll buy out, and that part won't work. Don't show them any money because if they saw some money, they might get some ideas. Just keep all the money behind closed doors. Whatever you do change, focus on the easy stuff. Focus on fast track, okay? If that's all you did, there's some easy wins there, make some fast track. Even that doesn't work unless you actually provide the physician time to make it work. But it's relatively easy to do otherwise, and if you do that, you improve things. And don't do anything more than fast track, and this is the guaranteed result. The fast track will improve, but of course, the rest of the department, the admitted patients will come in and eventually close everything down. 4, take no risks. Any kind of management, any kind of change involves some risks. And if we don't take any risks, then who's going to take them? Who is better set to know what the risks are? We take no risks, then of course what we're doing is really passing on the risks to the patients who come in the door, and they don't know what to expect. They don't know how to control it. So, in fact, EDP4P is about understanding the risk. It is about minimizing it. It is about doing what you think will lower the risk because there isn't anyone else better to take the risk. But there's no such thing as no risk. And of course, we work, I don't have to tell you this, we work in one of the most risk-averse industries around. And the last thing, of course, is it really is about the money after all. All that stuff we did at the beginning, all that stuff we showed, all this chanting of it's not about the money, it's not about the money, forget that. It's actually about the money. And if you believe that, and if that's what you put in, then it isn't going to work. So I'm going to stop there. And I'll see if there's any questions, and sort of a quick overview of a very big topic. So I'll stop. Julian, you want to get in there?
Yeah, thank you, Les. That was excellent. Thank you very much, and that was a great talk. I'm going to quickly hand this over to Joanna, who can unmute people's lines. We'll leave everybody muted, and if you could just raise your hand, which if you from the desktop you can go. There's you can go to the top of your screen, and it'll push you back to the main page, and on that you'll have a hand icon, which is on the panel on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side of the panel. You can raise your panel and a hand, and that will be an indication for us to unmute you and let you ask your question. So that was excellent, Les. Could I ask one first question? And then I see one question being texted here that we'll get to speak to. The first one is you raised the points, the 5 points of how not to have ED P4P be successful. And one was not to show the financial or the results to the staff. And could you get a little bit more into that and why you feel that it's important to shield them from that?
Well, what I'm saying is actually those are all ways to fail. So, in fact, if you want to succeed, you should do exactly the opposite of all those things. Because if you don't, the way I did that question was, here are the ways to fail. Okay. So, in other words, if you we don't want to fail. So you want to show the money. In fact, the most successful departments actually do show the money, and whatever comes in is the direct measure of the earnings because it's feedback. It's the way. Okay, this is how you've done. Feedback is one of the basic principles of quality improvement. If you don't give people feedback on how they've done, then how do you expect them to improve? And the money is a way of combining everything into one result. If you show people, well, you did this and CTAS 1, 2, 3s, but by the way, the admissions did this and so did that, it's hard to follow a lot of things all at once. And so people kind of just back off a little bit because it's more complicated. The nice thing about the money is that everything's bundled into one thing. It's a dollar value. Well, if the dollar value is going up, then you're doing better, and if the dollar value is going down, then you're not doing well, so you've got to do something about it. Then you might say, well, what part of it wasn't going well? Why is the dollar value going down? Is it because of admissions? Is it because of... But that's a second level question. It's an ability to focus everything in on one thing. The other thing it tells them is that if you're dealing about money, it tells them how much they have to work with. I mean, if you're down a little bit, you've got a little bit of a surplus, then that's small. But if you're developing a big surplus, you have more to work with. People who want to make changes, they need to know that. They need to know how they're doing, and they also need to know how much they've got to work with. Hope that answers your question.
And I have a question from Noreen. How can you tease out improvement from P4P from other improvement work being done, for example, RAS or streaming and overcapacity protocol? And I wonder if P4P motivates hospitals to focus on improvement efforts like RAS and the OCP. Can you comment on that, please?
Well, P4P just simply recognizes improvements if they exist. And a lot of improvements come in and they improve for a little while, then people forget, and then things are back to square one. One of the things P4P does is it reminds you that what you did 6 months ago is no longer working because suddenly the money's gone. And so it focuses your attention. It's amazing that and when I worked all of us probably had the experience with management at least. Emerge is bad. Well, emerge is always bad. Kind of, tell me another story. But if the message isn't emerge is bad, the message is we're losing money. We are actually in a deficit position. It's getting worse and worse. It actually gets people's attention. So P4P doesn't change what you do. You can decide to do a RAS. You can decide to do something else. You can do push-pull strategy. You can decide to do some staffing changes. The point is, fine, but did the results change? Did are people's experience better? Have you been able to shorten the time in emergency and provide better, faster service? So that's really all it does. The P4P doesn't change anything else. Now, does it motivate hospitals? Well, actually, the answer is not straightforward. Some hospitals will get motivated. In general, initially all the hospitals were keen and they're all motivated. But attention wanes over time. I mean, it's like anything else. You can get your kids to make their beds for a while, but if you turn your back on them 3 months later, they're probably not making their beds anymore. And the same thing happens in hospitals. They lose focus on it, or they can lose focus. So P4P was, if it works, it's not just the hospital, it's the whole health authority has to get behind it, the staff has to get behind it, and it's not just ER staff, because as we all know, emerge staff has no control over those admissions. I mean, that's entirely controlled by the staff in the wards. And if you set it up inadvertently so the ward staff decide, oh, those emerge guys are always getting everything they want again, and the rest of us poor people, we're nobody, we're chopped liver, we're going to dig in our heels, we're not cooperating. If that's the result you get, well, it's not going to work very well. So incentives are always, a two-edged sword. You have to be careful. You don't always get what you expect. You have to be careful how it's done. Sometimes it's as simple as how the message is put across, as it will make the difference between a result you expect and one that you weren't expecting.
That's great. Thank you, Les. I'd like to open it up now to the attendees. If anybody has a question, if you could raise your hand. Just scanning the audience, I don't see any hands right now. I just want to, while I'm looking here, is to let people know that we have recorded this session, and it will be posted on the Evidence to Excellence website, which is www.evidencetoexcellence.ca, and that'll be posted up later today. So you should be able to view this at your leisure at a later date. The other thing is that I want to let people know that Les is also going to be talking at the WEDOC, or Western Emergency Department Operations Conference, which we're holding in Vancouver, April 27th and 28th, and he'll be talking on a very similar topic, 4P certainly, but there'll be opportunities to engage him there as well. And so I encourage you to look out for the soon-to-be coming advertisements for that conference. It's the WEDOC conference, April 27th, 28th, here in Vancouver. Sorry for the free advertising. I wonder if, Joanna, if it's possible to unmute everybody. I see it for time. Sure. I wonder if we're having problems with their hand, finding that hand icon. And then we can just see if anybody wants to just speak up. But I don't see any hands.
Maybe I covered everything.
Oh, I see a hand.
Yeah.
Bruce Harris, we're going to get you 1 second.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, great. Thank you, Bruce.
Can you hear me okay? So I'm almost reluctant to ask this, but I know that the evidence for motivation theory, sort of coming out of social psychology, Dan Pink and other authors like that, that the evidence is solid and it's overwhelming, and that's the opposite of what's proposed in Pay for Performance. Can you talk a bit about how is it that this has been able to overcome what I'll call it the theory of motivation would suggest sits on the opposite side?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if opposed to the theory. I think motivation is complex, and a lot of it is how it's done, and the devil is completely in the details. I think in healthcare at least, if you try and motivate people on an individual basis with individual rewards, it doesn't work. And if you actually make it the money and you say, we're going to give you the money, that doesn't work. And so you have to find something to motivate them with that actually, A, they want, B, is believable to them, that it's achievable, and then you have to put your money where your mouth is, in the sense that you have to give them a taste of success somewhere. There's lots of different ways of doing this, and there's lots. I tried to point out some of the methods of failing. There are more methods than that of failing in motivation. So I don't think it goes against the theory. I think it depends on the parts of the theory you look at. I would agree with the point that if you look at incentive-based plans that have been put into place out there, especially in the U.S., a lot of them have failed. And it's not because there's anything fundamentally wrong with the principle of motivation. It's because they were done badly. Either the endpoint was defined badly, and then they got measurements. The measurements improved, but actually they missed the whole point. There are, you can alienate a lot of people by doing it wrong. And so I think that, yes, the results weren't there. I think a lot of it was because it was done badly. A lot of them rushed into it. In a lot of cases, the people who designed the strategies weren't people who worked in the field, so actually they didn't understand it. They made assumptions that weren't valid. So I think it's something that you have to take extreme care with. I would say that it can work. Obviously, it doesn't always work, and I agree with that.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Les. We'll get the last one. It's 1 minute too. So, Vic Wood, if you have your hand raised, so we'll if you could ask your question now, please.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Les. I think what P4P misses is what's been missed by hospital administrations across the world, which is we've got a one-way valve in which patients come into emergency, but we don't have any control over the patients being discharged from the emergency or from the hospital, and so they pile up. And until we get institutions, hospitals, CEOs that make a commitment that the resources in a hospital are finite and that they have to be managed, and set up a system so that they're managed so that patients who are the least sick are discharged from the hospital, then we will continue to have patients, as we have had for the last 30 or 40 years, as you alluded, that are just going to pile up. And what, P for P will work for a while. It's more of a Band-Aid than a solution. And what we need is some direction from the top so that a system is in place so that only the sickest patients remain in hospital. Now, if it ends up that only the sickest patients that are in the hospital are too sick to be going home, then the hospital institutions have to start putting more pressure on other places that they're lacking the beds, such as the long-term care beds and those patients that are filling up their hospital. And those problems go well beyond the emergency department. But hospital administrators, by and large, dump the problem in emergency, leave it there, and that's where it's been for decades. And I don't anticipate it's going to change anytime soon. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously, Vic, I do agree with that point. However, I guess my answer to that is this is a huge system issue. It's been with us. It's been growing for a long time. You can't fix something that big all at once. You have to decide where it is you're going to start, and then you build this house. In fact, the hospitals that have been successful using motivation created in EDP4P have been able to do exactly what you say. Having said all that, they still hit the wall at some point because their facilities are limited, and our ability to invest in infrastructure here, using the way the system is here in government, is very, very poor. So, in fact, they still get themselves up against the wall. They still have to breach that barrier, and that's the part that's also being done. But you can't start in an area where the measurement systems are very poor, because you can put an awful lot of money into the community resources and those things that need to be beefed up, and you won't know what you're getting for it. And that's been the trouble over the years. So I guess the way I explain it is, we're building a house here. It's going to be a multi-year process with many, many pieces being built as we build it. We can't complain because the rooms are still drafty, because so far we've got an infrastructure we're building on some kind of foundation. There are a lot of other pieces going in here that, of course, EDP4P is just a tiny, tiny piece of. In the end, hopefully all those pieces will be together, and we will have something that can handle it. But I agree with you. It's going to be a mouthful because we've been in this for a long, long time, and turning the ship around is going to be tough.
Thanks, Les.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. We're out of time. Again, thank you very much, Les. This has been an excellent talk, very provocative and informative, and I look forward to further discussions arising out of this. So just to let everybody know again, Les will be featured and be present at the WEDOC conference, April 27th, 28th, and you can view this on Evidence to Excellence website later today. So again, thank you much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh. Julian? Oh. So I'm speaking. Good. I was just trying to speak to you there. Yeah, and saw that you had disconnected. Okay. Oh, here, let me.